Welcome to my YouTube channel, Surowicz Watercolor. At any time during this video, you can click on the icon in the lower right hand corner to subscribe to my channel. This is a narrated tutorial for my painting Rocks. The photograph on the right was a reference for this painting, and while it's representational of the photograph, it wasn't an attempt to make it photorealistic, it's more suggestive. I still stayed somewhat loose in my approach, using big washes and creating textures to represent the various elements in this photograph. Another approach would be to take a small brush and work in a very precise manner to do a photorealistic version of this reference. Before I begin to paint, I'll review the colors that I used to accomplish this painting. Quinacridone burnt orange, quinacridone gold, quinacridone coral, rose madder quinacridone, alizarin crimson quinacridone, royal blue, cerulean blue, sap green, and Halloween orange. While I have quite a range of colors, they're used in a manner to create a variety of grays and neutrals for the most part. I've drawn a light sketch of just the major shapes on my paper. I'm working on an 8 by 10 inch sheet of 140 pound cold press watercolor paper, so it's not a big painting. Often I'm painting landscapes and florals, and occasionally I like to do something that's a little different and something that you can have a little fun with and play around with. So I decided to do this painting today for this video, and it's a painting of rocks. It's a pretty straightforward approach, but even with this, you still have to think about composition. And as I said at the start, I could take an approach here that is a very super realistic approach, but I'm taking more of a suggestive approach. So I'm putting down just some big washes, some shapes. Then I'll be creating textures and doing some glazing over these, just to give a suggestion of this collection of rocks that are in this sand. This was actually along a river. This type of a painting can be very repetitive at times, so there's a few spots where I'm going to speed this up. I'll continue to talk, but I'm going to run it at 3 times normal speed here and there, just to make this a much more efficient demonstration. You saw on my list that I had some fairly bright pigments that I was working with. So the burnt orange, the quinacridone gold, the quinacridone coral are all fairly strong pigments. But in my application, I'm mixing these with some of the cooler tones. The burnt orange I'm mixing with the royal blue and the cerulean blue. I'm doing the same with some of the quinacridone coral, the alizarin crimson. And I'm using those all together in various combinations to make a variety of grays. So you can see the first shape that I painted has a red tone to it. It has some rose madder quinacridone in it, a little bit of cerulean blue, and then a touch of yellow. So that mixture has 3 of the primary colors in it. It has a yellow tone, a red tone, and a blue tone. And when you start to mix those in various ratios, you can get a variety of neutrals. It can lean towards red or yellow or blue, warm or cool. But that's how I'm going to use those colors throughout this painting. I'm working wet on dry, and one of the things I need to be aware of is the moisture content in the paper in different areas as I paint these shapes. If I have 2 shapes that are right beside each other and I paint one and I paint the other, I can expect to have some mingling of the paint on the paper. Those colors are going to merge together. So there's times where I'm going to just kind of hop around here so that I don't paint a shape that's near another shape that's wet and create an undesirable result. So here the paint is damp, the paper is damp, and I've taken a spray bottle and I spritzed that. And then when it dried, you can see that it started to fill in a little bit. If I let that dry a little bit more, that texture would have been sustained. For the most part, what I'll be using in this is I'll thoroughly dry these shapes. then I'll spritz them with water, and then I'll use a tissue and lift some of those areas off that will create a texture. Now here's a mixture of the gray where I've added a little bit of sap green to, but it's still very much a neutral. And then in that wash I've put in a little bit of a royal blue mixture that has some other colors in it, but it's leaning towards that royal blue tone, and I'm letting those kind of gradate into one another here on my paper. I've painted a few more shapes here, and I'm going to get a couple more. And again, you can see how I move around the composition so that I don't have wet edge on wet edge. And I've got a variety of grays here. They're mostly grays. Some have a bit of a red tone, some have a blue tone, there's a little bit of greenish cast to some, and some are fairly neutral gray. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to dry what I've painted here, and I'm going to create some texture on these. I've thoroughly dried my paper, and now I'm going to spritz it with a coarse spray. But this is just a little bottle. It's not my fine mist spray that I like to use. If I just push down a little bit on the push button on top, it gives a coarse spray. If I fully depress it, it's more of an atomized spray, but if I just give a slight push on the top, it'll give more of a spritz. That'll create some texture, and I lift it with a tissue. And you can see that texture that's created by the lifting that I did on those flat washes. Now I've hit a spot where I'm going to speed this up as I do more of these rock shapes in the same manner. As I continue to paint these shapes, you'll notice how the gray tone shifts from warm to cool. A little bit of a red, a little bit of a green tone, a little bit of a blue tone, and these are all just combinations of the paints I listed. I don't have any gray paint, I just mix my neutrals. So sometimes the base gray that I'm working here is a combination of royal blue and Halloween orange, or royal blue and burnt orange, or cerulean blue and Halloween orange. Those can give me a gray, and then I can kind of tint that gray by adding a little bit of a rose madder, or a quinacridone coral, or a quinacridone gold, or a little bit more blue to the mixture, and I can shift that neutral around, making it warm, cool, neutral, and that's how I approach this. Here I'm going to paint some of the smaller pebbles that are in between some of the larger rocks, and I just put in a pretty simple wash on top of them. A few of them I'll charge a little bit with some color, but just giving an indication where some of these rocks are at. And then I'm going to come in with a darker value and paint around these shapes. I'm back to normal speed, and I've thoroughly dried this once again, so I'm going to take my bottle and I'm going to spritz all these areas that I've painted in with these kind of pretty much flat washes, and I'm going to take my tissue and I'm going to lift some paint to create the textures on these rocks. So you can see how well that lifts, and it creates an interesting texture that gives a suggestion of what you would see on these rocks. Now if you were taking a very super realistic approach to this, you would be trying to paint in all of these textures, and it would take a much longer time. It's a much different approach. There's nothing wrong with it. That's just not how I choose to paint this. And if you don't get enough of a texture on your first pass, you can just keep spritzing in the areas where you want to get that texture until you have the result that you're after. I've inserted the reference photo in the lower left hand corner so you can get an idea of the direction that we're headed. And now we're going to paint this one rock which if you look at the reference photo is much different than the rest. That's one of the things that I liked about this reference photo, is it has all these very neutral gray toned rocks, and it has this one larger rock with a unique coloration. So I've painted the whole shape with clear water to saturate the paper in the area where that shape is. And I'm taking some quinacridone gold and a little bit of burnt orange quinacridone, and just try and give the suggestion of what's going on that one rock. So you can see how I have that like diffused gold tone. And I'm going to take a smaller brush here with some burnt orange, and now I'm working wet and wet, because I saturated that paper, and I've come in and dropped some color, and now I'm continuing to drop some color in there and letting it diffuse a little bit so it softens the edges of these marks. I'm making some fine marks with this small brush, but because I'm working on saturated paper, those marks start to diffuse and soften. I'm not trying to copy every mark that's on the rock in the photograph. I'm just giving a suggestion of the marks, just with the technique that I'm using. I'm going to splatter a little bit of darker color in there, and because that's wet, the marks are going to diffuse a little bit and soften up. And it just creates another level of texture. I want to get a little bit more of the splatter. And this paper has slowly started to dry up a little bit. It's still pretty wet, but I've got a little richer pigment rich mixture of quinacridone and burnt orange, and so it's got a little bit more body to it. And that combination of a little thicker paint mixture and a little drier paper will start to let these marks stay a little bit more in place, but they're still going to soften around the edges some, because there's enough moisture in that paper to do that. I've thoroughly dried it, and I'm going to spritz it just as I did the other shapes and do a little lifting on top of that. Now I'm going to start to paint these areas between the rocks, and I'll be using a dark value mixture here that'll be combinations of royal blue, burnt orange quinacridone. I'll be using some alizarin crimson and some quinacridone gold. And I'm using a number 4 round brush. It's got a pretty good point, but it holds quite a bit of paint. And I'm just going to start painting around these shapes. And as I do, even though it's a dark value, you should see some subtle shifts from warm to cool tones. So some of these the mixtures are leaning more towards the burnt orange, and other mixtures are going to be leaning more towards the royal blue. And there's also some times where I'll bring in a little bit of an influence of alizarin crimson. So this is another area where I'm going to speed this up as I paint these areas in between these rocks. So now I'm painting around the various rock shapes that I painted, and this is at 3 times normal speed. And you should see some shifting here from cooler dark values to warmer dark values. And if you look at the top left there where I started, you can see some burnt orange that transitions more into a blue. Right now the area I'm painting has more of a cooler tone, and it helps set off that orange in that rock to the left there, the larger white and orange stone, because they're at opposite sides of the color wheel here. The blue is going to help that orange stand out a little bit more in contrast. And there again you can see some burnt orange and some royal blue being gradated together there on the paper. And this is a pretty dark value. This is about as dark as I'll go. I might go a little bit darker in a few areas once this is dry. just as I did with the rocks, I'm going to use this spritz technique to do some lifting on the areas that I painted in between the rocks to give the suggestion of a sandy soil. And before I did this, I thoroughly dried those areas that I painted. As I said, you can come back in if you don't get the texture you're after. If you want a little bit more, just come back and spritz it again until you can get the texture. Occasionally you'll hit an area that's just stubborn, doesn't want to lift, but for the most part it works pretty well. Now I'm going to start to glaze over the rocks to put some of the areas in shadow and make them feel more three-dimensional. So the colors that I'm using are the same colors that I've been using all along, the same mixtures. It's just a thin wash that I'm applying over top of these. And then I'll take some clear water and I'll soften the edge of some of the brush marks that I'm making. These glazes are for the most part colors that are similar to the area that I'm applying it on, but in some areas I'm going to change the color just a little bit, and on this rock here I'm going to put a cooler glaze on. It's a little darker value, and then take some clear water to soften that edge. You can see how it starts to make that feel more three-dimensional. Now I'm going to go back to painting the areas that are in between these rocks. Here I'm stepping through these a little bit because it's very repetitive. I'm taking the same approach across the whole composition. Here I've worked my way down to the lower left-hand area of the painting. And you can see that right now I'm using a very cool mixture, and that contrasts the area that's above it where there's more of a reddish orange tone. So if you look across the areas that I've painted in between these rocks, you can see how it goes from some red tones to blue tones to almost some yellow gold tones and almost olive tones in some areas, and I go back to some of the cooler colors again. In the shape that I'm painting now, I've gone from a burnt orange to a blue gray, and now I'm going more towards a warm gray here. It's got a bit of quinacridone gold in the mixture, and it's a little lighter value than some of the areas I've painted. Now I've thoroughly dried this, and I'm going to spritz these areas that I just painted in between the rocks with the coarse spray, just as I did in the rest of the painting, so that I can create that kind of a sand-like texture in those areas. So I'll take my tissue and I'll lift it off, and you can see the pattern that suggests that it's grainy and sandy in between there. And I'll come back and hit a couple of those areas again. Now I'm going to glaze over some more of these rocks, and I'm going to speed this up because this does get very repetitive. So now we're moving at 3 times normal speed, and I'm just dropping some of these glazes over the rocks. And just as I did with the rocks themselves, I'm varying some of the color. Just trying to cast some shadows. And you can see how it starts to become more three-dimensional when you start to glaze over these. Otherwise, they're very flat. And in most instances here, I apply a light glaze and I come in with some clear water, and And you can see too at times I'm using a tissue. And even though I'm putting this glaze on, you'll still see the pattern underneath from where I lifted with the spritz of water, even more so once it dries. Now I'm going to work with some darker values in the areas between the rocks. So I went pretty dark initially, but now I'm going to put some touches of even a darker value just here and there. A few of these areas I'm putting some of this glaze over the entire shape. In other areas I'm just making some small marks. I want this area to be a bit darker valued here than what it is, so I'm going to glaze over with this kind of a dark neutral gray. It's almost a charcoal gray actually. And now I'm just thinning it out with water. I've been using the spritz to lift off and leave some light value texture on these rocks. Now I'm going to take my brush with some dark value paint from my palette. I'm going to splatter that just by tapping my brush on my hand, and it's going to create some more of that texture, but with a dark value, so that complements the lighter value textures that I've been putting in. And it's characteristic of the dark kind of speckled effect that you have on the rocks. And I'm going to glaze over a few more areas on these rocks to strengthen a little bit the shadow. Just a little bit here to soften that edge of this rock. Now I'm using some clear water. And I'm going to get some on this right hand side just to tone down the brightness of a few of these areas and just help give a little bit more dimension to the rocks. I'm going to get some more of these down towards the lower right hand side. And I'm going to soften these edges a little bit. I'm going to use my fine mist spray bottle. This is a different spray bottle than what I've been using. It helps diffuse the color and soften edges. So it just helps that glaze run a little bit, and it creates a nice gradation on the wash that I've put down. I'm going to do the same over in this area. You can see how I get an edge when I put that in, then I soften it with that fine mist spray. And a little bit more of the same here. I'm going to put a little bit more of a red tone of a glaze up here, a dark value, but a little bit more of a red tone, and then soften that with the fine mist spray. I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it. And there you have my painting, Rocks. I hope you enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my videos, or if you want to learn more about my self-paced and live online courses, be sure to click on one of the boxes on the screen.